Okay, so I'm going to show you a couple of different techniques. We're going to go through the wash, we're going to go through the gradated wash, the glaze, scumbling, splatter, drip. We'll talk about the difference between wet on wet, wet on dry, dry on wet, and using things like Q-tips. So for now, I don't want you writing anything down or trying anything. You're just going to watch, okay? So again, at the top, you're going to write additive, okay? Watercolor at the top so that you remember what you did. When we're working with washes, okay, and you'll want to look up here, when you're working with washes, you'll want to use the biggest brush that you have. So you'll notice that my new brush here is kind of crunchy, okay? Your new brushes might be kind of crunchy. The reason for that is they've actually been coated with a water-soluble glue to keep them from bending during the shipping process, basically. So all you need to do is put it into your water, and that will soften them again, and it will dissolve the glue, okay? And they'll be soft, okay? So if you're using brand new brushes, you need to soften them in water first, okay? Now, again, you guys, I want your brushes down though right now because I want you to be looking up here and seeing what I'm doing. So with the wash, you'll want to use the biggest brush that you have, and you're going to add lots of water. So you're going to put your brush into the water, get it really wet, and then you're going to choose a color. Now, as you're working with your colors here in your brand new palettes, if you have a brand new palette, just be mindful that you're going to try not to mix colors in the little pans, okay? So try not to mix colors in the pans because that's going to cause like yellow to become green and so on and so forth. We don't want that. So I've got a blue here, and with a wash, we drag our brush along the paper and we're just trying to make a nice even area of color. That's it, okay? So we're just trying to create a nice even area of color, and we might need to go over it a few times if we want a certain depth of color, or we can just make sure we're adding more paint to our water, okay? Now the key with watercolor is that it is watercolor, okay? We never use straight color from the palette. We always mix it with water. The mistake a lot of people make is they try to make it look like acrylic paint, okay? It is not acrylic paint. We want it to actually be watercolor. We want it to look like watercolor. So if we want to do a gradated wash, for example, we can start with lots of color. So you can still get lots of color, okay, by really adding lots of paint to the brush. So I'm really adding lots of paint, and then I've got my color here. So it's going to be quite dark to start with, but then it's going to get lighter. So I've got quite a loaded brush is what we call it when it's loaded with paint. And I'm going to start with going at the top with my really dark color. Okay, then every time I go next, I'm going to dip it in water first and then drag it down. So I dipped in water and I'm just going down. I might get a little bit of water off my brush by putting it on my paper towel. But you can see as I'm going down the page, as I'm just dipping it in water, it's getting lighter and lighter. Now I've got some paint that's following me down here, but you can kind of see along this edge where it's gone from dark to light. Okay, so how we do that is we just dip in water, go to our page, maybe use our paper towel to get it a little bit dry. Okay, if it's going where you don't want it to, you just use your paper towel to get off that extra. That's your graded wash. The next one is called a glaze. So with a glaze, you're going to use less water, but you're still using water. So I've got my brush in the paint. Okay, I might even get a little bit of the paint off on a paper towel. And then the glaze is basically allowing the paint to sit on top of the paper without it soaking in so much because there's not so much water, but there's still water, okay, because you have to use water. But you can see it's looking a little bit different than these because we're not seeing the texture of the paper as much because that water's not sinking in, okay? So I'm just gonna label these as I go along. So I've got my wash, and then I've got my gradated wash. And this is called my glaze. Okay. Okay, next is scumbling. So I'm going to use a different brush for scumbling, maybe like a rounded tip kind of brush. And notice what I did with my brush here. Okay, I left it sitting on top of the water. So try to get this into the shot. I've left it sitting on top of the water like this. Okay, why do you think I did that instead of this? Why did I do that? No, not because of the color inside. Why? It wrecks the brush, okay? The brushes are held together with glue around the metal part here, okay? You leave that sitting in water, eventually over time, the glue softens and then this pops off the brush. Also, it bends the bristles at the bottom of the water container. We don't want that, okay? So always leave them sitting on top like this for all kinds of brushes. That's how you'll keep your brushes nice. Okay, for scumbling, we'll still want a fair amount of water on the brush with our paint. I'm just going to mix a different color here. So you can mix colors in your palette, but try not to mix it on the actual puck of paint, okay? So scumbling is just kind of going up and down with the brush. It's kind of like dabbing, and we're just getting a different texture, right? So we're getting a different texture because of the way that the paint is sitting on top of the paper and also the way the bristles are contacting the paper. Okay, so what we're doing with watercolors is we're just trying to experiment with how can we get different kinds of textures, right? Because we can get so many cool textures with watercolor. Okay, so that's scumbling. And then we'll do a dry brush. So for dry brush, it is what it sounds like, right? What is my brush going to be? Dry. Okay, but not completely dry, but we want it to be somewhat dry. Okay, so you'll want your paper towel for that. And again, you still need some water. So I'm going to go into maybe some red here. And I've cleaned it off before I went into the red so that I make sure that I don't have like purple on there. And then I'm using my paper towel just to brush off the excess, okay? So there is still some paint on there. It's not completely dry, but it's not super wet either. And then when I go onto my page, you can see it's starting to pick up the texture of the paper a bit more. We can see there's a little bit of an edge there, okay? So that's dry brushing. We want to almost get it dry enough that we're seeing the texture of the paper underneath the paint. Okay, wet on wet. Okay, so with wet on wet, we want to first put down water. So I've got a clean brush, lots of water, and I'm just putting a bunch of water on the page. So clear water. It's a little bit gray. You can't see it in the video, but it's a little bit gray. And then, so get it really wet. And then you can go and get some pure color on your brush. Okay, and you're just going to drop it in to the water. I might switch brushes. But you'll see it's starting to spread out in the water. So there we go. That's a bit better. I've got a bit more water on this brush. So we still want some water on the brush as we're getting in the paint. And then you can see it starts to kind of spread out, which is really cool. And you can actually start to add in different colors together, and you'll see how they sort of blend and mix in between. So you can get some cool textures this way too. Okay, so that's wet on wet. Okay, don't be afraid to use lots of water with watercolor. That is what watercolor is about. The most common thing I see with students is they're afraid to use a lot of water. The other thing you need to remember with watercolor is you kind of need to let it do what it wants to do, right? Water can't really be controlled. So if you're a perfectionist, you need to sort of let go of that perfection during this unit and allow your brush and your water to flow and do what it wants to do, because then you will actually get some really interesting textures if you just let go of that control a little bit. Okay, so what I just did was wet on dry, so it's pretty straightforward. You just have a wet brush with color, and this is wet on dry. Okay, so you're just adding that on, and you see it keeps the shape of whatever you're putting down, right? Dry on wet is kind of what I was doing when I was trying to do wet on wet first, and it didn't go so well because that's not what I was trying to achieve. So again, if we put some just water down, and then we get quite a bit of paint on our brush. So lots of paint on our brush, but our brush is not very wet. Okay, that's dry on wet. So you can see the paint is not spreading out quite as much as it did here, but I'm still getting a really cool texture. It's kind of like tie-dye texture, right? So that is dry on wet. And then a couple last ones are pretty fun. So we've got splatter, and we've got drip, and we've got Q-tip. So for splatter, you'll want your big brush and a bit of water on it, not too much, but a bit. And then get lots of paint on your brush. So I'm really dipping it in. Now this brush isn't very great quality because I'm getting hairs coming out already. That's how you can tell if it's a good quality brush, is if the hairs stay in or the hairs come out. So with splatter, you're going to take your paintbrush and you're going to put your fingertip underneath. Okay, and then the action is to bring the fingertip up and the brush goes down. You can see the paint is splattering. So I'm actually not moving my brush. My brush stays still. It's my finger that's moving. And it does go everywhere. So just be aware if you're going to do that, clear the area or know that the paint's going to get everywhere. And then finally, drip is where you're just going to get some color. And I'll do it at the bottom here so I can drip up. And you'll want quite a bit of water, and I'm making a line of color here. So I'm making a line of color, and then I'm going to tilt the page and hope that it does what I want. It's not doing what I want. I might have to encourage it a little bit to drip. Normally I would give you guys straws to blow it, but we can't really do that with masks on, but I can show you. So then you get a little bit of a drip going, okay? And then with a Q-tip, you can just use your Q-tip kind of like a paintbrush. So you can go into your paint and use it like a paintbrush. You can do dots with it, and so on. So I'm just going to label these splatter and drip. I don't have room for a Q-tip on my sheet, so I'm just going to let you guys experiment with that on your own. And that is your additive. So I want you to try as many of these as you can fit on one page. Okay? Sound good? Okay, let's try it out.